Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. A couple of years ago, our guest today, Adam Haslett, wrote a book collection of short stories called You Are Not a Stranger Here. And that was, for a short story collection, more than modestly successful. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize and also for the National Book Award. Now he's written a novel called Union Atlantic, published by Doubleday, and he's here to talk with us. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
In this, your first novel, this is a book that focuses on the first decade of the 21st century, and it's been much praised. I want to cite one review by a bookseller because, very simply, I agree with what he says. And it's a fellow by the name of Bill Cusimano of Nicola Books. I don't know where that is. And he says, in part, in my long ago years as a graduate student historian, I learned quickly that novelists often give the truest account of an era. And that's what Mr. Haslett has done in Union Atlantic, shown us a world afflicted with a malaise that it is impossible to overcome for those still bound by ethical and moral strictures. And I found that, in my own learning experience, that so often a novel just hits it right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's the novelist's job, in a way, to pay attention to the world that we're living in. And the advantage, I guess, is that we get to slow down and pay attention to a lot of things that zoom past other people because of how fast the culture moves and how aggressively distracting it is. And so you get to pay attention to some of those longer trend lines, and that's the stuff that I was focusing on when I wrote the book.
What you were sure you were careful not to focus on were such intricate things as, how interest rates are developed and stuff like that.
Well, yeah,
you wonderfully stayed away from that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, one strand of the book is about the Federal Reserve and the troubled bank, Union Atlantic, and it's true that I think even Tolstoy couldn't have written a novel about interest rates. So
probably true.
So I stuck to the crisis management function of the Fed, which. At the time I was writing it, I was worried nobody was going to really know what the Fed was or be interested in banking, and then I finished it the week that Lehman collapsed, so it suddenly became kind of timely.
Yeah, and what you were aiming to talk about is what I think you call the power which is anonymous of the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, there's the fact is we live in a country, we've decided to govern ourselves through a lot of institutions that exercise a lot of power, and we don't know who the people are that are exercising that power. Mm-hmm. And the decisions they make are often about very abstract things like numbers and financial instruments. But the result is that your neighbor could lose her job, or the economy could tank in the way that it has. So part of me was really interested in finding out what is it like to be, what is the mind of the person who's making these highly abstract decisions that have really concrete consequences.
That really is one of the most important, if you'll excuse the expression, messages of the book, that all this seemingly abstract activity, bigger than you can grasp, comes down and to affecting people that you and I would know every day.
Yeah.
And it's a scary part of it.
Well, I think that's the thing that's so difficult, I think. I find it difficult myself, and one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try to grapple with it, is that the larger forces in the culture are so huge and constant, but we're always being bombarded with little bits of news about this or that, or distraction of celebrity this, celebrity that. Whatever it is, and it's very difficult to even stop to imagine the relationship between these big we sense it. We sense that there's a relationship between the big forces in our daily lives, but it's very hard to stop and think through it. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that a novel does is it allows the reader to slow their attention down a little bit and travel through a set of experiences that other people are having in the world that they recognize, and that's the power of fiction, I think.
And though the book is much about banking and policies and avarice and greed and the quest for power, at its heart, in another way, it's a book about a test of wills between a fellow the name of Doug Fanning and a much older woman by the name of Charlotte Graves. And what a wonderful way that is to get into it, I think.
Well, yeah, I do always. I mean, to have something be effective drama, you want to make something concrete. And here, the conflict that a lot of the book centers on is between those two characters you mentioned. Charlotte Graves is a retired history teacher who's living in an old family house in a town west of Boston. And she's in her 80s, I think, isn't she? Yeah, late 70s, early 80s. Her mind's beginning to go a little bit. She's beginning to hear her two dogs speak to her, and one of them speaks to her in the voice of Malcolm X, and the other one in the voice of Cotton Mather.
I love that choice of characters for the dogs.
Yeah, well, they're in a way, I kind of think of them as the unconscious of American liberalism. You've got the religious voice that's saying you're never doing enough, you're indulging yourself, you got to give more to the sick and the poor. And on the other hand, you've got that guilt over slavery, that kind of primary guilt about race in America. And so those two voices are the ones that are kind of biting at her.
Yeah. Well, in Union Atlantic, we mustn't forget, Charlotte also, as you said, converses with her two dogs named Cotton Mather and Malcolm X. Oh, really? Yes, really. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Union Atlantic. That is the title of the debut novel of a very wonderful writer, Adam Haslett. His book is published by Doubleday, but more than that, at least in my mind, it's a Nan A. Talese book. And that always means something special. Now, on the back of the jacket, there's remarks by Gary Steingart, and I'd like to share them. Adam Haslett's page-turner of a debut novel ranges brilliantly from the Strait of Hormuz to the outskirts of Boston to the belly of the financial beast. I love that. New York's Federal Reserve. It explains to me, with humor and style and generosity, how we became America in the year 2010. A must-read. So, thank you, Gary. That's very nice.
Yeah, no.
That's excellent. Now,
no complaints.
Charlotte, who's, I must confess, probably my favorite character because she's so fascinating and she's, to my mind, unforgettable. And we mentioned that she carries on conversations with her dogs. She talks to them, and they talk to her. And you use this device for some reason in order to develop her character?
Well, yeah, I think of her as someone whose her mind's beginning to go a little bit, and it seems perfectly, I don't know, I mean, natural, maybe too strong, but the idea is that she is beginning to have these ideas that are bouncing around her head are kind of bleeding into the world a little bit. And we all know people who talk to their pets, and just when I was writing this, it struck me that the natural place for those voices to go were the creatures that she was already talking to, which are her dogs, and so they kind of speak back at her. And it also, from a writing point of view, it gives me a chance to go to a different kind of rhetorical register because they speak in these really these sort of oracular voices.
They sure do. Well, as you say, Charlotte is kind of losing it a little bit, but once, way back when, she was a brilliant student who, unlike most brilliant women of her era, showed a lack of deference. And at another point, you describe her as an awkward fit for the world. It's an interesting way to see her.
Well, she in the late 50s, early 60s, she's getting a PhD. She wasn't married by the age of 30. She was, unconventional for that period, and that sense of having to be a real independent socially stuck with her. And so even when she's in this town in, a relatively liberal state of Massachusetts, she still feels kind of at odds with the powers that be.
She is kind of arrayed against Doug Fanning, who is young. He has been in the Persian Gulf War, was involved apparently in shooting down a plane filled with people, a non-combatant plane. And there's a point in the book where he kind of talks about himself, or at least thinks about it. All day from his office window, he could see into the neighboring tower, where workers clicked away at their screens, filling their filing cabinets with endless records of prices and depreciations, liabilities likely to pay, until they no longer noticed the bargain struck between meaningless days and whatever private comforts they'd found to convince themselves the meaninglessness was worth it. But it was different if those workers were your muscles and tendons, and by your will you directed their exertion, regulating the blood of cash. Then you weren't an object of the machine. You were something different, an artist of the consequential world, a shaper of fact. Not the kind of author Sabrina that's his secretary wanted to be, some precious observer of effete emotion, but the master of conditions others merely suffered. That's a hell of a high opinion, I think.
A high opinion of himself.
Yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, Doug is an angry, somewhat vengeful guy who has participated in and is involved with two of the forces that I think have dominated our national life for the last 10 years, which are militarism and finance capitalism. And I think that the emotion that underlies both of those is anger. I mean, in the military, obviously a certain kind of aggression is part of what's required and what they do. In finance, it's a little more behind the veil, but there's a real aggression there, and they're both very male-dominated fields. And so, usually it's easy for people in a position like me, I've not been in the military, I've not been in banking, to just stand and judge that. But as a novelist, that's not what I want to do. I want to get inside and understand. And, he doesn't start out as the most sympathetic person in the world. He may not end that way for some readers, but the effort on my part is to try to find out what that psychology is about.
And this is certainly true. You do not judge. You don't judge him. You don't judge anybody else. You just, in a sense, lay them out for us, and we can come to our own conclusions. But I want to tell you that the phrase that ends that particular paragraph I was reading, the master of conditions others merely suffered. Whew, that's something.
Well, I think that it's an attitude that a lot of people might share at the moment towards the financial elites of the country.
It's true. Union Atlantic, as one of the reviewers said, is a page turner. But there are a couple of times when you slow down because you just want to enjoy the wit of the writing, like when the sheep take over a party. Just stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. It's Jim Foster. He's your host. That's me. The title of our book today is Union Atlantic. It's a novel. The author, Adam Haslett, is with us. The book is published by Doubleday under the aegis of the wonderful Nan A. Talese. And O Magazine, in the person of Vince Passaro, has this in part to say about the book. If novelists are in charge of telling us who we are as individuals, as a society, then Adam Haslett has become a novelist. Haslett has a deeply informed and imaginative grasp of history, and his book reads like a thriller, but it is, stealthily, much more than that. A chronicle of the collective corruption whose fallout we are, right this minute, enduring. Wow. I think it's accurate as I read the book. That corruption, you sum up in one point on the book when you talk about where Atlantic Securities has gotten. Atlantic Securities, you write, and not its supposed clients, held thousands of future contracts obliging it to purchase Nikkei tracking shares at a price hundreds of points higher than where the Japanese index now traded. McTeague's positions represented a loss of $5 billion. They really got in the hole, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, it was the funny thing about the whole timing, and having written this and finished it just as the crash commenced, was that a lot of this stuff had been going on for a long time, and the instability of the financial architecture, I think, was apparent to people who'd followed the Asian currency crisis or the collapse of other hedge funds and everything, and it to me, it's a backdrop for this larger question of the moral climate that we're living in, because obviously banking is just the most exaggerated and, it turns out, damaging place where that happened. But obviously it happened in real estate, it happened in all sorts of areas of life where there was a kind of just lack of any inhibition and an incredible capacity to think in the short term, and it's easy afterwards, as I was saying before, to simply step back and judge that if you weren't involved in it and say, well, it's not my fault, and obviously there's judgment that's due. But a novel, I think that's what sort of nonfiction can do. But what a novel does, at least the ones I like to read, somehow take you into the texture and the rhythm of these people's minds and lives, and as we say, not just the banker. He's one character in the book, but there's Charlotte. There's also a high school senior named Nate Fuller who comes to be involved with both Charlotte and Doug, and there are these other lives. And what I wanted to show was sort of how this stuff infects everyday life in a way, and the way that everybody deals with it, whether they're involved with it or not.
Can we go to the party now?
Sure. Let's go to the party.
It's a 4th of July party. It's being held at Holland's property. Mr. Holland is the boss of the place, right?
Yeah, head Union Atlantic.
And Mrs. Holland starts to invite her people, and then the husband starts inviting his people, and the thing is growing and growing and growing, and it's 104 outside, and for some reason, I believe you say that they keep sheep so they can get a tax break. Because
they get a tax break for the small family farm.
That's right, the small family. So there's sheep around, but the sheep have been placed inside the house?
Well, no, the sheep rather have been put inside the 4-car garage.
Oh, the garage, right? Okay.
Because they need the field for the excess parking. So
somehow
you get the sheep in the garage, and then one of the high school kids, who's one of the other characters in the book, is a little high, and he wanders along and accidentally opens the doors of the garage, and out pour this flock of sheep that then sort of run across the driveway and into the party, where all these bankers and town worthies are drinking and eating, and it turns into kind of a mess.
And then the sheep are continually doing what sheep tend to do when they're running around.
Exactly.
And
well, this is set in 2000. It's set in 2002. That party in the summer of 2002, and a lot of the people there. She didn't think she was going to get a lot of people at the party, but because it's 2002, people don't want to go into the big city because they're worried that there's going to be some kind of terrorist attack.
Terrorist attack, yeah, right.
And so it's at some point, a vegan who sees a security guard abusing a sheep shouts "terrorist," and that spooks what's left of the party, and they run themselves into the field.
Oh, it's an absolutely lovely scene, I think. There's there's another scene in the book, not as humorous, but I guess the word might be poignant. The scene in the courtroom when David is challenging Goliath over whether Doug actually owns the land that he built his house on.
Well, yeah, I mean, Charlotte Graves' real complaint about Doug Fanning is that he's built this house on land that her grandfather donated to the town for preservation, which the town then went ahead and sold. And so she roots around in the records at the town hall and figures out a way that she thinks that the town's actually violated their own law by selling it.
And all the while, the judge is calling Charlotte, how nice to see you. I remember how wonderful your history classes were.
Yes.
And David wins. And you'll win if you run out right now and buy a couple of copies of Union Atlantic. I think a couple because you can discuss it with your friends. It's a wonderful first novel by Adam Haslett. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.